A war in Venezuela could spiral out of control and no one is talking about it. Let me take you back to March 26 of this year. That's when the U.S. Southern Command quietly deployed a carrier strike group led by the USS George Washington off the coast of Venezuela. Officially, it was just another routine exercise, part of the annual Operation Southern Seas. The Pentagon called it a demonstration of commitment to regional security. The State Department insisted it was about deterring malign actors. The media, as usual, moved on after a day or two. But here's what they didn't tell: this wasn't just another drill. This was the largest U.S. naval deployment near Venezuela in decades. And it came at a moment when tensions between Caracas and Washington were already at a boiling point over sanctions, over oil, over a disputed election that both sides claim was stolen. Now, I've been tracking U.S. military movements in Latin America for over 20 years, and I can tell you when the world's most powerful navy parks an aircraft carrier off a country's coast, it's not a routine exercise. It's a message. And the message: we are prepared for war. But here's the real kicker: no one in Washington seems to have thought through what happens if Venezuela calls their bluff. Because if this escalates, we're not talking about another Iraq or Afghanistan. We're talking about a conflict that could pull in Russia, China, Iran, and half of Latin America. A war that could collapse global oil markets, trigger a refugee crisis dwarfing Syria's, and force the U.S. into a quagmire it can't afford, all while the American public remains blissfully unaware. That's what I'm going to break down for you today. Not the official story, the one where Venezuela is just another rogue state that needs to be brought to heel. But the real, the one where a miscalculation in Caracas or a misstep in Washington could light the fuse on a regional powder keg. The one where the U.S. is sleepwalking into a conflict it doesn't understand, with allies who don't trust it, and adversaries who are waiting for it to overreach. So let's start with the narrative you've been fed. Then we'll tear it apart. The official Venezuela as the failed state. Here's what they want you to. Venezuela is a dictatorship run by Nicolas Maduro, a former bus driver turned strongman who rigged the 2018 election, crushed dissent, and turned one of Latin America's richest countries into a basket case. Hyperinflation, mass starvation, and a mass exodus of over 7 million refugees, these are the hallmarks of 21st century socialism, a cautionary tale about the dangers of left-wing populism. The U.S., in this story, is the reluctant hegemon, forced to intervene because no one else will. Sanctions? Necessary to squeeze the regime. Military exercises? Just a show of force to keep Maduro in line. And if things get worse? Well, the U.S. has a responsibility to protect the Venezuelan people from their own government. The numbers seem to back this up. The IMF estimates Venezuela's GDP has shrunk by 75% since 2013. Oil production, the lifeblood of the economy, has collapsed from 3.5 million barrels a day in 1998 to barely 700,000 today. The bolivar is worthless. Hospitals lack basic medicine. And Maduro? He's presided over it all with a mix of repression and incompetence, jailing opponents, shutting down media, and even stealing the 2020 parliamentary elections by replacing the opposition-led National Assembly with a puppet body. The U.S. has a long list of drug trafficking, human rights abuses, and, of course, the fact that Venezuela sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves, more than Saudi Arabia. For Washington, this isn't just about democracy. It's about control. A pro-U.S. government in Caracas would mean a secure energy supply, a check on Chinese and Russian influence in the hemisphere, and a strategic win in the broader competition for global dominance. But here's the problem with this: it's only half true. And the half that's missing is the part that could get us all killed. Deconstructing the what they're not telling you. Let's start with the sanctions. The U.S. will tell you that Maduro's economic collapse is entirely his own doing, that socialism failed, and sanctions are just the final nail in the coffin. But the data doesn't support that. In 2019, the Center for Economic and Policy Research published a study showing that U.S. sanctions, particularly the 2017 financial embargo and the 2019 oil sanctions, directly caused an estimated 40,000 deaths between 2017 and 2018 alone. That's not hyperbole. That's excess mortality, people dying from preventable causes because the country couldn't import food, medicine, or fuel. The UN Special Rapporteur on Sanctions, Elena Duhan, visited Venezuela in 2021 and concluded that U.S. measures were devastating and violated international law. Even the Wall Street Journal, hardly a leftist outlet, ran an investigation in 2020 showing how sanctions had crippled Venezuela's ability to refine its own oil, turning a potential economic recovery into a humanitarian disaster. Now, you might well, Maduro brought this on himself. And to an extent, that's true. His mismanagement was catastrophic. But here's the thing about sanctions: they don't just hurt the regime. They strengthen it. Because when you cut off a country's access to the global financial system, the only people who can still operate are the ones with black market connections. And who controls the black market in Venezuela? The military. The same generals who prop up Maduro. The same ones who profit from smuggling, gold mining, and drug trafficking. So what's really happening here? The US is not weakening Maduro. It's entrenching him. And it's doing it in a way that makes negotiation impossible. Then there's the election. The US and its allies, Canada, the EU, most of Latin America, refused to recognize Maduro's 2018 victory, calling it a sham. They backed Juan Guaidó, the self-declared interim president, and imposed sanctions to force Maduro out. But here's the part they don't talk: Guaidó never had real power. He was a figurehead, a creation of Washington and the Venezuelan opposition's elite. The military never abandoned Maduro. The poor, who make up the majority of the country, never rallied behind Guaidó. And by 2023, even the US had quietly dropped its support for him. So why did the US push this strategy for so long? Because it wasn't about democracy. It was about regime change. And regime change, as we've learned the hard way in Iraq, Libya, and Syria, is a lot harder than it looks. Now, let's talk about the real motivations here. Because this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about geopolitics. The great how Venezuela became a proxy war. Venezuela isn't just a country. It's a battleground, one where the US, Russia, and China are fighting for dominance in the Western Hemisphere. Let's start with Russia. Moscow has been Maduro's biggest backer since the Obama administration first imposed sanctions in 2015. Rosneft, Russia's state oil company, has been the lifeline for Venezuela's oil industry, helping it evade US sanctions by buying crude at a discount and selling it on the global market. Russian military contractors, Wagner Group operatives, have been spotted in Venezuela, training Maduro's forces and providing security for high-level officials. And in 2019, when the US backed Guaidó's failed coup attempt, Russia sent 2 nuclear-capable bombers to Caracas as a message. Why? Because Venezuela is Russia's foothold in America's backyard. If the US can topple Maduro, it sends a signal to every other anti-American government in the UN, and that's a risk Putin can't afford. Russia's economy is smaller than Italy's. Its military is stretched thin in Ukraine. But in Venezuela? It can bleed the US without firing a shot. Then there's China. Beijing has loaned Venezuela over $60 billion since 2007, most of it never repaid. In return, China gets oil. Lots of it. Venezuela sends China around 300,000 barrels a day, often at below-market prices. And unlike the US, China doesn't care about democracy or human rights. It cares about stability, because instability means no oil. So while the US has been trying to isolate Venezuela, China has been deepening its ties, investing in infrastructure, mining, and even military cooperation. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The US sees Venezuela as a threat to its hegemony in Latin America. But Russia and China see it as an opportunity, a chance to erode US influence in a region Washington has long considered its sphere of influence. And that's the key phrase: sphere of influence. Because this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the rules of the 21st century. The US has spent the last 30 years acting like it can intervene anywhere, anytime, for any reason. But Russia and China? They're pushing back. They're no, you don't get to decide who rules in Caracas. Or Damascus. Or Kiev. The world is multipolar now. And that's what makes Venezuela so dangerous. Because if the US tries to force regime change through sanctions, through military pressure, through covert action, it's not just risking a war with Venezuela. It's risking a proxy war with Russia and China. And that's a war no one can win. The military, why this could spiral out of control. Let's talk about the USS George Washington. When that carrier strike group showed up off Venezuela's coast in March, it wasn't just a show of force. It was a dress rehearsal. Because if the US ever decides to take military action against Venezuela, this is how it would, with a naval blockade, a no-fly zone, and airstrikes on key military targets. But here's the Venezuela isn't Iraq in 2003. It's not Libya in 2011. It's a country with one of the most battle-hardened militaries in Latin America. The Venezuelan armed forces have been fighting insurgencies, drug cartels, and economic collapse for decades. They're not the Iraqi Republican Guard, disorganized, demoralized, and easy to roll over. They're a cohesive force, with Russian and Iranian advisors, advanced air defense systems, and a population that, despite its suffering, still largely supports the military. Now, let's say the US launches airstrikes. What happens next? First, Maduro will retaliate. He's already threatened to attack US oil refineries in the Caribbean if the US strikes Venezuela. And he's not bluffing. Venezuela has Russian-made anti-ship missiles that could sink a US destroyer. It has Iranian drones that could hit US bases in Colombia or Puerto Rico. And it has cyber capabilities that could disrupt US financial systems, something Iran has already done in retaliation for US actions. Second, Russia will respond. Not with a direct military confrontation, that's too risky. But with asymmetric measures. More Wagner Group operatives in Venezuela. More arms sales. More disinformation campaigns to destabilize US allies in the region. And if the US escalates? Russia could escalate right back by sending more bombers to Caracas, by deploying submarines to the Caribbean, or by arming Venezuela with advanced weapons systems. Third, China will exploit the chaos. Beijing has already said it will not recognize any US-backed government in Venezuela. And if the US tries to seize Venezuelan oil assets? China will buy them up, just like it did in Iraq after the 2003 invasion. Because for China, this isn't about ideology. It's about resources. And that's the nightmare: a US intervention that fails, leaving Venezuela in chaos, Russia and China entrenched in the hemisphere, and the US bogged down in another unwinnable war. Now, let me be, I'm not saying the US can't defeat Venezuela militarily. It can. But at what cost? How many US troops would die in an urban war in Caracas? How many Venezuelan civilians? And how long before the rest of Latin America turns against the US? Because here's the thing about military: they never go as planned. Iraq was supposed to be a cakewalk. Libya was supposed to be a humanitarian mission. Afghanistan was supposed to be a quick war. And in every case, the US ended up worse off than before. Venezuela would be no different. The domestic why Washington can't resist the temptation. So why is the US even considering this? Why risk a war that could spiral out of control? Because domestic politics demands it. Let's start with Florida. The state is home to over 1.5 million Venezuelan exiles, many of whom fled Maduro's regime. They vote. They donate. And they hate Maduro. For politicians in both parties, opposing Maduro isn't just good policy, it's good politics. In 2020, Trump won Florida by just 37,000 votes. In 2024, the state could decide the election. And if you're a Democrat or a Republican, you cannot afford to look soft on Venezuela. Then there's the oil lobby. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. And right now, US Comies are banned from operating there. But if Maduro falls? Those reserves go up for grabs. And the Comies that get in first, Exxon, Chevron, Halliburton, stand to make billions. So you can bet they're lobbying hard for regime change. And finally, there's the foreign policy establishment. The same people who brought you Iraq, Libya, and Syria are still in charge. They still believe in American leadership. they still think the US can reshape the world in its image. And they hate the idea of Russia and China gaining a foothold in America's backyard. So when you put it all together, Florida politics, oil money, and neoconservative ideology, you get a perfect storm of pressure for intervention. And that's dangerous. Because when domestic politics drives foreign policy, bad decisions get made. How this could play out. So what happens next? Let's run through the possibilities. Scenario 1, the best case, a frozen conflict. In this scenario, the US and Venezuela reach a cold peace. The US eases some sanctions in exchange for limited democratic reforms. Maduro stays in power, but he allows opposition parties to participate in elections. Russia and China keep their influence, but they don't escalate. The US saves face, Venezuela gets some economic relief, and the region avoids war. This is the least bad outcome. But it's also the least likely. Because neither side wants to compromise. Maduro doesn't trust the US. The US doesn't trust Maduro. And both Russia and China have an interest in keeping the conflict alive. Scenario 2, the most likely, escalation without war. In this scenario, the US and Venezuela engage in a proxy war. The US increases sanctions, funds opposition groups, and conducts covert operations. Venezuela responds with cyber attacks, drone strikes on US assets, and support for anti-American groups in the region. Russia and China provide weapons and intelligence. The conflict stays below the threshold of war, but it's constant, like the Cold War in Latin America. This is where we are now. And it's unsustainable. Because eventually, someone will miscalculate. A US drone strike will kill a Venezuelan general. A Venezuelan missile will hit a US ship. And then we're in Scenario 3. Scenario 3, the worst case, a regional war. This is the nightmare. The US launches a limited strike on Venezuela. Maduro retaliates by attacking US bases in Colombia. Russia sends more military advisors. China starts arming Venezuela with hypersonic missiles. Iran gets involved, using Venezuela as a base to launch attacks on US shipping. And suddenly, the US is fighting a multi-front war in its own hemisphere. This is how wars start. Not with a declaration, but with a miscalculation. And once it starts, it won't stop. Because no one wants to back down. The grand strategy why the US keeps losing. Here's the hard: the US is losing the 21st century. And Venezuela is just the latest example. For the last 30 years, the US has operated under a doctrine of liberal hegemony, the idea that America can, and should, reshape the world in its image. Democracy promotion. Regime change. Military intervention. The problem? It doesn't work. Iraq? A disaster. Libya? A failed state. Syria? A quagmire. Afghanistan? A 20-year humiliation. And yet, the US keeps doing the same thing, expecting different results. Why? Because the foreign policy establishment is asterisk. Stuck in a feedback loop of its own making. The think tanks, the defense contractors, the career diplomats, they all benefit from the status quo. Conflict means budgets. Budgets mean promotions. Promotions mean influence. And influence means they get to keep playing the same game, even when it fails. The 2003 Iraq War wasn't just a strategic blunder, it was a feature, not a bug, of a system that rewards activity over outcomes. The same people who pushed for regime change in Baghdad are now whispering in the ears of policymakers about Caracas. The names change, but the playbook doesn't. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about ideology. It's about geography. Venezuela sits at the crossroads of three critical: the Caribbean, the Andes, and the Amazon. Control Venezuela, and you control the flow of drugs, migrants, and most importantly, oil. The US has spent the last century ensuring no rival power could dominate its near abroad. That's why the Monroe Doctrine still matters, even if no one in Washington wants to admit it. When Russia parks nuclear-capable bombers in Caracas, Or when China builds a deep water port in La Guaira, it's not just about Venezuela. It's about signaling to the US that the rules of the game have changed. Let me explain why this matters. The US military is designed to fight two wars at once. That's the official doctrine. But here's the uncomfortable: it can't. Not anymore. The Pentagon is still structured for the Cold War, with a force optimized for large-scale conventional conflicts against peer adversaries. The problem? Those adversaries have studied US tactics for decades. Russia's Gerasimov doctrine, hybrid warfare, cyber, disinformation isn't some brilliant innovation. It's just the realization that the US can't be beaten head-on, so you erode it from the inside. China's anti-access/area denial strategy in the South China Sea? Same logic. And now, both are exporting those tactics to Venezuela. Take the military balance. The US has 11 aircraft carriers. China has 3, but it's building more. Russia has 1, but it's got hypersonic missiles that can sink a carrier from 1,000 miles away. The US still has the edge in raw firepower, but that edge is shrinking. And in a conflict over Venezuela, the US would be fighting on 2-1 in the Caribbean, the other in the Pacific. The Navy's already stretched thin. The Air Force is flying geriatric planes. The Army's still recovering from 20 years of counterinsurgency. And the Marines? They're busy retooling for island hopping in the Pacific. A war in Venezuela would force the US to: do we defend Taiwan, or do we defend Colombia? Here's the thing about miscalculation. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens when both sides believe they can win. Maduro thinks he can survive a US strike because he's got Russian S-400s and Chinese drones. The US thinks it can knock out Venezuela's air defenses in 72 hours because that's what the simulations say. But simulations don't account for human error. They don't account for the fact that the Venezuelan military is a hollowed-out shell, but it's got enough Russian advisors to make things messy. They don't account for the fact that the US might misidentify a civilian airliner as a military target, like it did in 1988 with Iran Air Flight 655. And they certainly don't account for the fact that once the shooting starts, the rules of engagement go out the window. Let's talk about Colombia. The US has 7 military bases there, including the critical Palancaro Air Base, which is the linchpin of US power projection in South America. If Venezuela hits Palancaro with a missile, the US has to respond. But Colombia is a sovereign country. Does the US need Bogotá's permission to strike back? What if Colombia says no? What if the Venezuelan attack is a false flag, designed to drag Colombia into the war? This is how regional conflicts spiral. It's not about grand strategy. It's about the fog of war, and the fact that no one has a perfect picture of what's happening on the ground. Now, consider the economic dimension. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. The US doesn't need Venezuelan oil, it's energy independent now, but it can't afford for that oil to fall into the hands of China or Russia. That's why the sanctions are so brutal. They're not just about punishing Maduro. They're about denying his patrons access to the global energy market. But here's the: sanctions don't work in a vacuum. They create black markets. They push countries into the arms of US adversaries. Iran and Venezuela have been trading oil for food and medicine for years, circumventing US restrictions. China's been buying Venezuelan crude at a discount, refining it in its own ports, and selling it back to the world. The US can sanction all at once, but the oil still flows. And in a war, that flow becomes a weapon. Imagine this scenario. The US launches a strike on Venezuela's oil infrastructure. Maduro retaliates by sinking a tanker in the Strait of Hormuz. Not a Venezuelan tanker, an Iranian one, flying a Omanian flag. The US can't prove it was Venezuela, but the insurance markets freak out. Oil prices spike to $200 a barrel. The global economy tips into recession. China and Russia step in, offering to stabilize the market, but only if the US backs off. This isn't hypothetical. It's how economic warfare works in the 21st century. And the US is playing checkers while its adversaries are playing 3D chess. Here's the real kicker. The U.S. foreign policy establishment keeps treating Venezuela like it's 1989. They think they can isolate Maduro, fund the opposition, and wait for the regime to collapse. But the world has changed. The U.S. is no longer the sole superpower. It's one of three, and the other two have a vested interest in seeing America fail. Russia and China aren't just propping up Maduro out of altruism. They're doing it because they want to bleed the U.S. They want to force Washington to make impossible defend Taiwan or defend Colombia? Spend money on Ukraine or spend money on Venezuela? The more conflicts the U.S. is involved in, the weaker it becomes. And the weaker it becomes, the more space Russia and China have to reshape the world order in their image. So where does that leave us? Right now, we're in the gray zone. The U.S. is conducting cyber operations against Venezuela's power grid. Venezuela is running disinformation campaigns in Florida. Russia is flying nuclear bombers to Caracas as a show of force. China is quietly building a surveillance state in Venezuela, complete with facial recognition and social credit systems. This is the new normal. It's not peace. It's not war. It's something in between. And it's only a matter of time before someone crosses a line. The question isn't whether a war in Venezuela will spiral out of control. The question is when. And when it does, it won't be because of some grand strategic design. It'll be because a 22-year-old drone operator in Nevada misreads a blip on a screen. It'll be because a Venezuelan colonel ICS and launches a missile at a U.S. ship. It'll be because a Russian advisor gives bad advice, or a Chinese general misinterprets U.S. intentions. War isn't a choice. It's a series of accidents, strung together by ego and miscalculation. And when it happens, the U.S. will be fighting on terrain it doesn't understand, against adversaries it can't see, with a military that's optimized for the last war. That's not a recipe for victory. That's a recipe for disaster. And the worst part? No one in Washington seems to realize it. Now, what most people don't realize is that the real powder keg in Venezuela isn't just the geopolitical chessboard, it's the domestic political tinderbox that's been smoldering for years. The establishment narrative paints this as a simple story of dictatorship versus democracy, Maduro the villain, the opposition the plucky underdogs. But reality is far messier. Venezuela's political landscape isn't a binary. It's a fractured, multi-sided civil conflict waiting for a spark, and the U.S. is treating it like a Cold War proxy battle when it's actually something far more volatile. Let me explain why this matters. The opposition isn't a unified force. It's a collection of factions with competing agendas, some of which are just as authoritarian as the regime they claim to oppose. You've got Maria Corina Machado, the hardline anti-Chavista who won the opposition primary in 2023 with 92% of the vote only to be barred from running by Maduro's Electoral Council. Then there's Enrique Capriles, the more moderate former governor who's been sidelined by both the regime and the radical wing of the opposition. And don't forget the military dissidents, like the ones behind the failed 2019 coup attempt, who are still out there, waiting for their moment. The problem? None of these groups trust each other, and none of them have a coherent plan for what comes after Maduro. That's not a revolution. That's a recipe for chaos. Here's the uncomfortable: Venezuela's opposition is as much a part of the problem as the regime. Take the 2019 crisis, when Juan Guaidó declared himself interim president with U.S. backing. It was a gamble that failed spectacularly. The military didn't defect en masse. The people didn't rise up. And Guaidó's government in exile became a punchline, a Potemkin opposition propped up by Washington while Maduro tightened his grip. The lesson? You can't overthrow a regime by wishful thinking. You need a viable alternative, and right now, the opposition doesn't have one. Now, let's talk about the military. This is where things get really dangerous. The Venezuelan armed forces aren't some monolithic bloc. They're a fractured institution, riddled with corruption, drug trafficking, and internal power struggles. The top brass, the generals, are deeply embedded in the regime's criminal economy. They control the gold mines in Bolivar State, the cocaine routes through the Caribbean, the food distribution networks that keep the population dependent. But the mid-ranking officers? The captains, the majors, the lieutenants? They're the ones getting squeezed. Their salaries are worthless. Their families are starving. And they're the ones who could turn. The US has been trying to exploit this divide for years. Remember Operation Gideon in 2020? That was the botched raid where 2 former US Green Berets tried to infiltrate Venezuela and capture Maduro. It ended with 8 dead, 2 Americans in prison, and a propaganda victory for the regime. But here's what no one in Washington wants: to that operation wasn't just a failure. It was a warning. The Venezuelan military isn't some paper tiger. It's a battle-hardened force that's been fighting insurgencies, drug cartels, and internal coups for decades. And if the US thinks it can just flip a few officers and call it a day, it's in for a rude awakening. Now, let's project some scenarios. Because this isn't just about whether Maduro falls, it's about what happens when he does. And the most likely outcome isn't a democratic transition. It's a civil war. Scenario: the regime collapses, but the opposition fractures. The military splinters, with some units loyal to Maduro, others defecting to different opposition factions, and the rest going rogue to protect their criminal enterprises. You end up with a Somalia-style failed state, where no one controls the capital, the oil fields are up for grabs, and the US is forced to intervene to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe. Sound familiar? That's Iraq 2003, but with cartels instead of insurgents. Scenario: Maduro clings to power, but the economy collapses completely. Hyperinflation hits 10 million%. The black market becomes the only market. The military starts selling weapons to the highest bidder, cartels, guerrillas, even foreign mercenaries. Venezuela becomes a narco-state with a flag, a failed state that exports instability to Colombia, Brazil, and the Caribbean. The US responds with sanctions, cyber attacks, maybe even a naval blockade. And then what? Do we invade? Do we let it burn? Neither option is good. Scenario: the US gets its wish, and Maduro is overthrown, but the new government is just as bad. Maybe it's a military junta. Maybe it's a populist strongman who promises order but delivers repression. Maybe it's a coalition of opposition figures who can't agree on anything and collapse within a year. The point is, the US has spent decades assuming that regime change in Venezuela would automatically lead to democracy. But history tells us otherwise. Look at Libya. Look at Afghanistan. Look at Iraq. Regime change doesn't create stability. It creates power vacuums. And power vacuums get filled by the worst people. Here's the thing no one in Washington wants to say out: Venezuela is already in a low-intensity civil war. It's just not the kind we're used to. There are no front lines, no uniforms, no clear battlefields. It's a war of attrition, fought in the shadows: assassinations, cyber attacks, economic sabotage, disinformation. The US is already involved, whether it admits it or not. The question isn't whether we're going to escalate. The question is whether we're going to do it by accident or by design. And that's the real danger. Because the US isn't just fighting Maduro. It's fighting Russia, China, Iran, and a host of non-state actors who see Venezuela as a battleground for a larger war. The Russians are already there, running Wagner Group operations in the gold mines. The Chinese are building a digital surveillance state that makes Orwell look, while the Iranians are supplying drones and ballistic missile technology. And the cartels? They're the wild card, the ones who could turn Venezuela into a narco-state overnight. So what happens when a US drone strike accidentally kills a Russian advisor? What happens when a Venezuelan missile battery, manned by Iranian technicians, shoots down a US surveillance plane? What happens when a Chinese cyber attack takes down the US power grid in Florida, and the US retaliates by sinking a Chinese freighter in the Caribbean? These aren't hypotheticals. They're the kind of escalation spirals that start with a single miscalculation and end with a regional war. The establishment wants to frame this as a moral crusade: good versus evil, democracy versus dictatorship. But war isn't a morality play. It's a brutal, messy, unpredictable thing. And in Venezuela, the US is playing with fire without a fire extinguisher. The worst part? No one in Washington seems to care. They're too busy reliving the Cold War to realize that this isn't the 1980s. It's the 2020s, and the rules have changed. The enemies have changed. The battlefield has changed. And if we don't adapt, we're going to lose. Badly. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the future of American power in the Western Hemisphere and whether we're even capable of wielding it anymore. The establishment still thinks in terms of the Monroe Doctrine, as if we can just snap our fingers and make Latin America fall in line. But that world died with the Cold War. Today, the US is facing a multipolar challenge in its own backyard, and we're not ready for it. Let me explain why this matters. The last time the US tried to overthrow a Latin American government, Guatemala in 1954, Chile in 1973, Nicaragua in the 1980s, it worked because we were the only game in town. The Soviets were a distant threat, China was still a peasant economy, and Iran wasn't even on the radar. Today? Russia is running Wagner Group operations in Venezuela's gold mines, China is embedding itself in the country's infrastructure through debt trap diplomacy, and Iran is supplying the regime with drones and ballistic missile tech. The US isn't just fighting Maduro. It's fighting a coalition of revisionist powers who see Venezuela as a beachhead for rolling back American influence in the region. Here's the uncomfortable: the US has no coherent grand strategy for Venezuela. We're stuck between two bad options. Option: double down on regime change, risking a direct confrontation with Russia and China. Option: accept Maduro's rule and watch as Venezuela becomes a narco-state with Russian military bases and Chinese surveillance networks. Neither is palatable, but the establishment keeps pretending there's a third way, a magical middle ground where we can have our cake and eat it too. The problem is that the US foreign policy blob still thinks in binary: either we invade, or we do nothing. But that's not how modern warfare works. The real battle isn't for Caracas. It's for the hearts and minds of the Venezuelan people, the loyalty of the military, and the control of key economic choke points like the Orinoco Belt's oil fields and the country's gold reserves. And right now, we're losing on all three fronts. Take the military, for example. The US keeps talking about a coup, but the Venezuelan armed forces are more fractured than ever. The high command is loyal to Maduro because he's bought them off with drug trafficking revenues and Russian weapons. The mid-level officers are disillusioned but terrified of defection because the last time they tried, in 2019, the regime crushed them with Iranian-trained intelligence units. And the rank and file? They're starving. A US intelligence report from last year estimated that 40% of Venezuelan soldiers are malnourished. You can't build a coup on an army that can't feed itself. Then there's the economy. The US keeps tightening sanctions, but all that's done is push Venezuela deeper into the arms of Russia and China. The Chinese have already bailed out Maduro with $5 billion in loans since 2018, and the Russians have taken control of PDVSA's oil fields in exchange for debt relief. The US thinks it's strangling the regime, but all it's doing is accelerating Venezuela's pivot away from the dollar and toward a new financial system, one where the yuan and the ruble replace the petrodollar. That's not just a Venezuelan problem. That's a global one. And let's not forget the cartels. The US Drug Enforcement Administration estimates that Venezuelan officials are directly involved in moving 200 metric tons of cocaine into the US every year. That's not just a law enforcement issue. That's a national security threat. Because the cartels aren't just criminals. They're armed, they're wealthy, and they have deep ties to the regime. If the US ever does try to topple Maduro, the cartels will be the ones holding the guns, and they won't be on our side. So what's the alternative? The establishment will tell you it's more sanctions, more covert ops, more moral grandstanding. But that's not a strategy. That's a recipe for disaster. If the US wants to avoid a war in Venezuela, it needs to do three things. First, stop treating this like a Cold War rerun. Russia and China aren't the Soviet Union. They're not trying to export communism. They're trying to erode American influence, and they're doing it by embedding themselves in Venezuela's economy and security apparatus. The US needs to counter that not with military force, but with economic leverage, by offering Venezuela a path back into the global financial system if it severs ties with Moscow and Beijing. That means conditional sanctions relief, not more blanket restrictions. Second, the U.S. needs to stop outsourcing its Venezuela policy to Colombia and the Lima Group. The Colombians have their own agenda. They want to crush the ELN guerrillas, not stabilize Venezuela. And the Lima Group? It's a paper tiger. The U.S. needs to lead, not delegate. That means direct negotiations with Maduro, not to legitimize him, but to create off-ramps for key players in the regime. The Iran nuclear deal proved that even the most hardline regimes can be brought to the table if the incentives are right. Third, the U.S. needs to prepare for the worst. Because if this does spiral into a war, it won't be a clean, surgical strike. It'll be a messy, protracted conflict with no clear exit strategy. The U.S. needs to start planning for that now, not with more aircraft carriers in the Caribbean, but with a real diplomatic surge. That means engaging with Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina to build a regional consensus. It means working with the EU to create a humanitarian corridor. And it means accepting that, at some point, the US might have to talk to the Russians and the Chinese, not as enemies, but as stakeholders in a shared nightmare. Here's the US still has time to avoid a war in Venezuela. But time is running out. Every day that passes without a coherent strategy is another day that Russia, China, and Iran dig in deeper. Every day that the US clings to its failed policies is another day that the Venezuelan people suffer. And every day that Washington pretends this is just another Cold War proxy battle is another day closer to a conflict that no one wants, but no one knows how to stop. I've spent my career studying how wars start. And the scariest thing about Venezuela isn't that it's a powder keg. It's that no one in Washington seems to realize they're holding the match.